Today, wind and solar globally are a few percentage points of global energy, but it's actually less than how much energy wood supplies to the world. There is no replacement at scale for liquid hydrocarbons. There just isn't. Roughly 60% of the jobs, the job titles, the nature of jobs, 60% of all the class of jobs that existed in 1960 don't exist as jobs today. If you assume 50% of all light-duty vehicles are battery only, that would reduce global oil use by about 10%. 10% is a lot in the oil market. Is that a transition to abandon oil?
You're watching the Financial Sense News Hour. Financial news for high net worth investors and strategists. When it comes to the biggest investment trends and understanding the market, we've been delivering the insights you need for over 30 years.
Today, we're standing at the intersection of three massive world-altering forces. First, a global push to fundamentally rewire our energy system. Secondly, a shifting geopolitical landscape where the supply chains of tomorrow are being fiercely contested today. And third, the explosive, unprecedented rise of artificial intelligence, a technology that is fundamentally hungry for one thing above all else: power. Today, we're going to be asking some hard questions about the physical reality of our digital future. Can we actually generate the electricity required to fuel the AI revolution? How do materials needed for wind, solar, and batteries shift global power dynamics? And what does a realistic future of energy look like? To help sort us through the noise and the hype, I've asked Mark Mills to come back to the program. Mark is basically the executive director of the National Center for Energy Analytics, as well as being a prolific author. Mark, I want to begin our discussion today after, let's say, a half a century of trying to make it otherwise. Oil remains the driving force behind America's domestic and geopolitical energy policy. We're seeing this basically after a half a century, another war over energy at the center of today's news. Let's begin with that.
Well, thanks for having me back, Jim. It's great to see you. The energy world never disappoints. When it's quiet for a while, it gets noisy. Predictably, not predictably in terms of the episodes, but predictably, there's always an episode that impacts energy markets. And to your point, I wrote a piece last month on the question was what is the center of the of geopolitics and energy? You know, where should we be focused? And I told the editors, it's the Civitas Journal for the University of Texas. So, well, the answer is easy. It's oil. It's not wind. It's oil. Period. Oil. He said, how could it? So, well, and you know this. Oil is the largest single source of energy for the world. It's the largest traded commodity by far, but it's misleading to say it's the largest single source of energy. As I challenge people in the energy punditocracy to tell me why it's not true to say this fact: every product and service, not 30%, every product and service in civilization is dependent on oil in varying degrees, somewhere in the supply chain. Not some, all, including the machines and materials that we hope to replace oil. They're dependent on oil to build and get the materials and assembly. So, you know, that's why oil scares politicians when prices go up. That's why every politician chases policies that can reduce the price of gasoline, well, with exceptions. Excuse me. The governor of California seems to have the opposite interest, and a number of leaders in Europe don't seem to worry about gasoline prices. But by and large, in the American political history, high-priced oil frightens politicians witless, and then if it gets really high, the prices escalate in these episodes where there's spikes. Then, if it stays high too long, really, really bad stuff happens. Not to the economy. The economy adjusts to the high prices. That's why they're always temporary. What happens is really bad policies are enacted because of the high prices, because it frightens politicians.
Well, California is a good example of that. You know, nearly all the policies have been directed, Mark, at replacing or reducing oil use, promoting or subsidizing conservation, efficiency, and especially alternative fuels. Our policy has been focused on reducing oil consumption, but today we're consuming more oil. I think it's about 20% higher today than it was 50 years ago.
Yeah, in fact, if we measure it from this may be the measure that's the most important. You're right. The world uses 20% more oil, and the U.S. uses more oil than it did 50 years ago. But if we measure it from a more recent benchmark, the turn of the 21st century, when we began spending serious amounts of money, like trillions of dollars, in the so-called energy transition, for which, the principal piñata for the transitionists is oil. We got to replace oil. That's been the target, right? So what's happened in the world since Y2K? Well, let's look at per capita use of oil, which is the most important measure because there's more capita, there's more people in the world. So per capita use of oil measured since the year 2000 is essentially flat. That it's actually down just shy of 2 percentage points, but it's flat. So you've had no change in the per capita use of oil in 2.5 decades, in something on the order of $10 trillion of spending to avoid using oil and other hydrocarbons. So clearly that experiment's expensive and not working if the goal were to replace dependency on oil. So the world, put differently, is just as dependent on oil, measured in the metric that matters, per person in the world, as it was 25 years ago. In absolute terms, of course, oil use is up in the world since then. In fact, it's up by a remarkable amount. I mean, if you measure it we'll measure it in EU equivalent terms. Since the year 2000, the world consumption of oil has increased by amount equal to double the EU's total consumption. So what's happened? Well, oil's more valuable, more expensive in terms of putting it at risk. So when we get a price spike, panic happens. Understandable because it's so important. But we should calibrate the price spike, incidentally. If we think about the current price, and I think as we're talking today, it's back to $90, having touched 100. To equal the price last peak price in 2014, to be equal to that in inflation-adjusted terms and as a share of GDP, which is an important measure in terms of economic impact. Those two, to adjust for those two, oil today would have to be $175 a barrel to match the last peak. And so I would say, so long as oil stays below $175 a barrel, its economic impact is functionally de minimis. I mean, even though all the panicking and all the hand wringing, yes, gasoline prices are up, and yes, diesel fuel is up and it inflates supply chain impacts, but all price spikes are temporary, and we haven't even come close, frankly, to the last peak price.
Oil remains probably the single largest source of energy, as we've discussed, and probably the largest traded commodity on the planet.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned, Mark, all products and services somewhere use energy. I just look around my house, the stained cabinets has something to do with petroleum,
Yep.
carpets, things of that nature. And it remains at the epicenter of commerce, geopolitics, as we're seeing play out today, and energy policy. And I think the one thing that we forget, it's irreplaceable. What do we have on the horizon right now that could actually replace it? I think sometimes our leaders forget that. We want to move away from it. We want to cut its use. We want to be more efficient. But what do we have that's on the horizon that will replace it? I don't say anything. Do you?
Well, there's nothing. So we've spent billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. That's the United States and Europe, trying to find what so-called drop-in replacements, biofuels, whether it's ethanol or biodiesel, battery-powered cars, electric trucks, airplanes. All those work. I mean, it's not technically that you can't do those things. It's that the issue of replacement, as you know, is replacement at the scales of which we need it, in the time that we need it, at the price we can tolerate. And what we've discovered is that there is no replacement at scale for liquid hydrocarbons, the natural liquid hydrocarbons. There just isn't. We haven't discovered it. We don't know how to make it, again, at scale, at prices we can afford. I mean, ethanol experiment is still underway in the United States after we put in the ridiculous mandates 20 years ago. So we now harvest 40% of all corn to make ethanol to put in gasoline. I think it's a bad idea. It distorts markets, but more importantly, it reduces our national oil use by a few percentage points all in, which is not a lot given the amount of money, and it costs more, significantly more than gasoline, 50 to 100%, depending on how you do the calculation. Uses More land, therefore its environmental impacts, and this is for a nation that's worried about water use, as you know, it's a common theme. Every mile driven with a gallon of ethanol from corn uses about 100-fold more water than the mile driven with all the water used to make gasoline. So it's a really bad idea, and it's very expensive. You could say the same about biofuels, about cellulosic ethanol, battery electric cars. Here's the most common rejoinder when I say you can't replace oil is, "Oh, electric cars are getting cheaper all the time and better." They are getting cheaper all the time, and they are getting better, and they're a lot of fun to drive, and tens of millions of more will be purchased without subsidies because a lot of people, like them, and there's a good reason to like them, and we know what the market is. It's the 2 to 3 car family where it's a nice option. But if you do the arithmetic, this is not physics, it's arithmetic. If you assumed we go from today's 3% of all light-duty vehicles in the world today are battery electric, 3% after billions of losses and billions of investment in China and here, 3 percentage points. If you assume 50% of all light-duty vehicles are battery only in the 20 years, pick your time frame, that would reduce global oil use by about 10 percentage points, 10%. Now, 10% is a lot in the oil market. It's Is that a transition to abandon oil? No. In fact, you could argue it would be very helpful for oil markets because of the quantity of oil we need, 100 million barrels per day. We're gonna need a lot more oil in the future, and having more electric cars will take pressure off the need for more oil for things where it can't be replaced, which is things like a lot of heavy equipment and machinery, industrial processes and mining, long distance aviation, all those things, there's no replacement.
The interesting thing about all of that, oil use is up, as we talked about, 20% more today. You had the IEA, I think it was a couple of years ago, they came out and they were urging oil companies to stop
Yeah,
exploring for oil because
yeah,
with EVs, wind, and solar, we're not going to need the oil anymore. It would be really a stranded asset. And here we are
uh,
consuming more. So you contend that oil demand will continue to rise. In other
yeah,
words, what we've seen in the last 5 years will probably continue in
yeah,
the next 50 years.
yeah, where these are high inertia systems, to use a physics term. Society is huge, the industrial processes supported are enormous, and they do change, slowly over time, but the near future, we'll call it the next 10 or 20 years, will look a lot like the near past, which is to say a very, very slow, a drift down in the share of oil as a part of the world economy, but it's a continual, incremental increase of the absolute consumption of oil because of growing economies, rising wealth. I mean, look, the one number you could use, the only fact you can find this using Dr. Google or one of your favorite AI chatbots, and, ask how many people in the world have never been on an airplane ever for a trip. We know the answer is billions, right? The number of people who take more than one trip a year in an airplane is fewer than a billion globally out of an 8 billion world population. It's hundreds of millions of people use aircraft, billions have never been on one. As they become wealthier, and they will, because that's what economies do, absent, you know, pestilences of like we've never seen, they will wanna fly too, and there is no replacement for big airplanes for oil. There just isn't. There's nothing vaguely, on the horizon. You could imagine it in the theory of physics. I could imagine that it's not hard to concoct, clever ideas for what physics might permit in the far future, but for the investable, plannable future for businesses and hedge funds and politicians, 20 years is forever. And over the 20 years, you could take to the bank, oil use goes up. By the way, the IEA, you made the point the IEA was advising in recent years that the oil industry should stop investing in new exploration and production because you were creating stranded assets. This was a demonstrably foolish thing to say, a demonstrably destructive thing to say to move financial markets away from investing in something vital, but also something that you didn't have to be an analyst to know that was really silly political statement and embarrassing that they did it. The good news is they've not only stopped saying it, they have had a 180-degree reversal in that posture over this last 6 months to 9 months. The new IEA outlooks and forecasts are saying unequivocally more investment is needed. And while they still see a peak demand for oil, instead of saying it's a year or two away, they're now saying it's pushed out far enough in the future that it's essentially, not their words, it's essentially irrelevant for planning. You need to plan for more investment, more drilling, more leases, more permits. And good on them for reversing course. I think it's very hard for them to have done that politically, given where the IEA is headquartered in Paris, and given the nature of the energy ministers that are on its controlling board. We're only one vote on the controlling board of the IEA, and our Secretary of Energy has gone to Europe and into IEA meetings and congratulated them for reversing course and admonishing them to do more because of the geopolitical importance of oil, which we're seeing play out right now in the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, nobody's missed the fact that the freezing up the Strait of Hormuz, which I think is temporary. Let's hope it's temporary. Is consequential to world oil markets because roughly 20% of world traded oil flows through there.
It's interesting. The Wall Street Journal did an article just a couple days ago on the new weapons of global power are oil, rare earths, and microchips, and they state the competition for global power will be one defined by the control of these critical materials and energy.
Yeah,
And what are we seeing play out in the Middle East today?
yeah. And oil and its hydrocarbon cousin, natural gas, of course, because liquefied natural gas is now a globally traded commodity and roughly the same dependency in terms of trade out of the Strait of Hormuz. So yeah, no, what people have missed, and they've been seduced by the explosive value of information technology in driving economic growth, and that's where a lot of both political, geopolitical, and investment interests is focused. And this is sensible. If you're an investor, you want to invest where there's growth, obviously. So if you're in an investment mindset and you want to play in an industry where there's rapid growth, that's the place to play. The other one, as you know better than I do, is where something that is not going away is undervalued, like oil, where you can also make money. But from an absolute sort of commodity market perspective, what happened is that people looking at the growth came to believe we had, the expression, decoupled from all this old stuff in the old economy. We've decoupled growth from the old industries like oil, coal, and natural gas, and steel, and metals, and mining. And this decoupling narrative was very seductive in the punditocracy and profoundly wrong, profoundly misguided. There's no decoupling. It's more strongly coupled than ever. But you don't see 20% annual growth rates in the global oil industry because it's already so huge. I mean, this is the law of large numbers. Tiny, tiny growth rates on huge markets. There's a lot of money. So 1% growth in the global oil market is a really big deal, right? It adds 1 million barrels per day of demand, which is more than most countries can produce. The Permian Basin is the country scale producer at 5 to 6 million barrels per day. Whereas, 20% compound growth rates on a trivial market, which is where essentially wind and solar still are, by the way, sounds exciting. Well, it is. But in absolute terms, they're small numbers because it's fast growth on a tiny number. So today, wind and solar globally are a few percentage points of global energy. Not electricity, but global energy, because energy matters, not just electricity. That's not nothing, but it's actually less than how much energy wood supplies to the world, by the way. Wood still supplies more energy to the world's economies, burning wood, than do solar panels and wind turbines.
It's interesting. You mentioned in the digital age and software, we weren't going to need raw materials because this digital age was going to replace them. And take a look at where we are now. We're reverting back to it
Yeah.
with physical resources from oil, rare earths to copper and industrial capacity are right back in the forefront.
Yeah. Well, everything electrical depends on copper. It doesn't matter whether it's a building, an appliance, an AI data center, lots of copper, lots of copper. Copper's hard to replace. Probably, if you're spitballing here, 80 to 90% of the applications for copper have no replacement. It's one of these, odd materials that's, excuse me, there are no easy workarounds because of the physics of electricity and metals. High voltage stuff is you can use aluminum wires and And you can imagine exotic applications for superconductors that are not made out of copper, as you know. They're a complex melange of other metals and minerals. See, but underlying this mythology is an inverse truth. It's not that the digital world meant we were less dependent on materials. The digital world made us more dependent on a broader suite of materials. If you look at the underlying the use of the periodic tables elements in a computer or a smartphone compared to the use of the periodic tables elements in the pre-computer age, the telephone age, you've increased by tenfold the number of distinct different elements that you use, presidium and neodymium and protactinium and all these exotic elements. We use a lot more cadmium, we use selenium, all these things that go into solar panels and motors and lasers and communication systems. It's like we're now moving towards using essentially the entire periodic table. Through most of human history, there were only a few elements on the periodic table that we could actually knew existed, that we could extract and do anything with because we didn't understand them. We didn't have technologies that needed them. So I actually see it in the inverse. The decouplers thought we were decoupling from the physical world. And what technology has done is increase coupling to things that are even more exotic and harder to find and guess. Iridium is an incredibly important element, astonishingly rare. Most of it's produced in South Africa. You don't get to make fuel cells without iridium or a lot of other things in the high-tech world.
And speaking of that, I want to move on to AI because it requires, as we talked about and you've written about, an enormous amount of energy. And there seems to be like a conflict going on. The building of AI data centers has become the new target of the environmentalists
Yeah.
and what I call the banana greens. Currently, over 30 states have introduced more than 300 data center related bills in the first 6 weeks of the year.
Yeah.
There are 11 states that have introduced legislation that would temporarily freeze construction of new data centers and to allow studies on utilities. We need to look at this from an environmental perspective. That's good for 5 to 10 years. Mark, we're in a race for AI with China. We could lose that race if we start restricting what we can do with these data centers. I mean, everybody loves your smartphone. We love all the apps that we do,
Yeah.
our iPads and things like that. We love online shopping, but all of that is made possible because of these data centers.
Well,
Let's
you're
talk
absolutely
about
right.
that.
Yeah, data centers are not new, although they're new to people as a term of art in the news. We've been building data centers for 2.5 decades, since the dawn of the internet. I mean, the first data center was in 1998 in Santa Clara. And over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, in the United States, we built something on the order of 5,000 data centers, which when I used to talk about data centers in the public space, people would look at you doe-eyed and didn't know what that meant. You have to explain what a data center was. And it's not complicated. It's a big building full of computers and communications gear, storage technology, and that's where Google resides. That's where your shopping resides, and you go online. It's where your videos are streamed. That's where you keep your smart, your smart apps. That's where you keep your pictures of your family, your vacations. They live in the cloud. The cloud is physically the data center. That's what that is. So if you say to people, do you want more data centers? If they start from the basis of thinking this is a new thing that's being foisted on them, to your point, is something that's already a physical infrastructure that's critical. What AI has done is has accelerated the size and number and nature of data centers, not eliminated the old kind. There's now, if you like, simplistically 2 classes of data centers or 2 kinds inside of a single building. The things that do all the conventional compute and communications, which makes shopping possible, and then the inference stuff, AI, that is coupled to it so that the physical shopping is still conventional compute, but the app that gives you advice, the inference, like, "Well, if you like this, you might like that." That AI has been around for a long time. It's not new. It's just that it's become new in the news. That's a separate rack or part of the data center. But your point you made is really interesting. I've been writing about this for quite a long time, as you know. It's not news to the technical community that AI is far more energy intensive than conventional compute. It is because it's essentially like a supercomputer. Supercomputers use more power because they do super things. So they work harder. They do crunch more information. And in the physics of information, if you crunch more information, you use more energy. It's no different than carrying more rocks in a truck. It'll use more energy. It's just locked into the physics of the universe we live in. We can make it more and more efficient, but here's the irony: is you make computing more efficient, we use far more computing than the efficiency, quote, saved, which is the story, incidentally, of computing over the last 50 years. The computer that you use and I use that we're using to talk right now, the smartphone in your pocket, it's sort of a million times more energy efficient than the computer of 40 years ago, a million times more energy efficient. And yet computing 40 years ago used almost no electricity globally. It'd be almost unmeasurable. Now, before AI, the computing ecosystem was already using twice the electricity of the country of Japan. And in the United States, it was already somewhere on the order of 4 or 5% of all electricity, which in a big country, these are really big numbers. So now we're trying to guess how much more electricity will it use? Well, the first answer is more, not less, right? How much more? Okay, it could double, could triple. It's not going to go up tenfold because, again, efficiencies come into play, costs matter. But if we see the electricity requirements of compute and AI collectively move into the same class of demand as lighting does, say, for example, which would be perfectly reasonable. Photons are weightless, right? Everything's lit up with photons. And it takes a lot of energy to make photons, to create lumens. AI and compute's very similar. We'll probably get to the same ratio. About 15 to 20% of all electricity is used for illumination. Perfectly reasonable to think computing goes there. But that shocked everybody in the utility industry and the electric punditocracy because they were living under the illusion that demand for electricity had been flat for 2 decades and would stay flat. Well, that was an interregnum period. It was not the normal. It wasn't a new normal. It was a temporary pause driven by a whole set of factors which were obvious at the time, but ignored, and are even more obvious in hindsight, not least which is when you get growth, a lot of growth in one sector that uses electricity, you'll create new demands. That's where we are.
It's amazing because we become addicted to online shopping, our smartphones, but all of that requires these infrastructure, which we're talking about, which is
Right.
data centers. Nobody is explaining that when they go and they put forth legislation. We want to stop this. We want to stop the building. Well, if you want to stop that, you're going to stop what you're using.
It's right. Well, yeah, they also will stop all the systems and tools that the lobbyists and the anti-energy and anti-growth people use. Everybody's using data and data centers. It's part of our infrastructure. In my book, as you know, which came out just before ChatGPT became known, I wrote, and I believe this is true because I show it in the data. The cloud infrastructure, and the book is called The Cloud Revolution for that reason. The cloud infrastructure is an infrastructure, and it's the biggest infrastructure humanity's ever built. Measured in dollars, measured in root miles, measured in tons, ultimately measured even in energy. When you count everything about the energy used to make the computer chips, energy used to transport bits, all the whole ecosystem is a massive energy consuming ecosystem. It's huge. And we've just started. It's already the biggest infrastructure by those metrics. And now we're at the early days of making it even bigger. So one would expect something that big would incite opposition. This is always true through all of modern history. When things get big, for reasons that are sometimes good, by the way, because big industries sometimes don't behave uh, entirely in the way we'd like. There's social license to operate. But when things get big, you get opposition. And so big buildings built where they're ugly, or big buildings use a lot of power, they get blamed for using too much water or too much power. You agitate people. But keep in mind, I think the agitation, this is my theory, playing amateur psychologist, not physicist, but what we've got is the data center opposition has coalesced sort of a melange of movements. People who are afraid of AI, so they identify the AI with the data center. It's where the language models learn. People who are, in other words, afraid of their jobs being lost. There are people who hate social media. Most people who use social media don't hate it, but there are people who hate it for good reasons. I'm not saying everything about social media is great, but if you hate social media, if you hate oligarchs and use Bernie Sanders where people make a lot of money providing these things, if you don't like things that are ugly, big data centers are not that pretty. And it's sort of as an aside, the people who hate data centers should be hating big windmills too, you'd think. But anyway, they don't like big, ugly things. And if you are worried about electricity use and the affordability issue and want to blame data centers, you take all those 5 issues and you focus them on just one thing, that building, that data center, that company's plan, and you pass bans because you've got a coalition of people with different hates and fears all agreeing, oh, we got to stop this. We got to take a pause. To your point, first, most of the claims are specious or hypertrophied or frankly silly. However, it's a serious issue because this is the epicenter of the next catalyst for economic growth, productivity growth, even warfighting and security. All these things are echoing again around compute, which is AI compute. And and you're absolutely right. The Chinese not only are not going to hold back and have bans on data centers, they're they're eager to win this race, and it's been framed as a geopolitical race, like like the Cold War. I think that's the wrong framing. This is obviously the technology can be used in war fighting. The right framing is that it's an economic geopolitical race, and it's a race for economic dominance, which is tightly linked to geopolitical and security and military issues. But it's fundamentally an economic dominance linkage. It's first. I think the bans will be feckless and fail because all that will happen is the data centers will go where they can be built. And if that's only in the 20 states that haven't, quote, banned them, then those 30 that did that will be losers. But America won't lose.
It's interesting because you mentioned Bernie Sanders. He's turned this into a socialist
Yeah,
issue. Basically, he's calling these oligarchs, as he refers to them,
that's right.
as they're doing this for power and greed to get more wealthy. And I think he made a comment. He gave a speech. He said, "If we stop building data centers, we could take the money spent on data centers and feed 40 million people for 4 years.
No, notice the key is we can take.
We
This
can
is
take." Yeah.
That's the key. So, socialists always look at markets that make choices to spend money and decide that they know better how private money should be spent. And that would mean either just taking it through taxes or outright just taking and nationalizing industries. Both of them are socialist, statist tendencies. So he's right. Money can be used to feed people. It's true. Money can also be used by private industries to create technologies that generate growth and wealth, which is what's happened for the last century, that make people wealthier and able to afford to buy food, even if food's expensive. The basic trope that he has that the oligarchs are doing this for money and power. Let's say there's some truth to it if you define the word properly. Every business that succeeds is measured by its wealth. It's measured by its ability to grow rapidly and do. If you were owned a business, or you're an investor in a business, what do you look at? Their growth. What do you measure? Not their physical footprint or their employees. The first measure is their revenues and their profits. More revenues with no profits is a loser. Everybody gets out of it. You can't make profit by growing with a negative number, as you know. So there's truth to it in that sense. But I'm being facetious. What he's talking about is he thinks their personal wealth is animating them. Most people I've met, and I've met hundreds of people who are entrepreneurs starting businesses, and that many become successful, all don't. That's not what animates them. The successful ones are not animated by they want to make money. They're animated by what they're doing. They're animated by their excitement about building the business that they're building. Obviously, the measure of success or ability to continue is that they make profits. But what animates entrepreneurs, most of them, is just building and succeeding. They like doing what they're doing. And his claim that they want just, quote, power, uh, it's the inverse. Most entrepreneurs worry about the power of the state to impede their ability to build things. That's what they're worried about. They're worried about the asymmetry and the power of government to crush industries. Even free governments, free countries, rather, like ours, have the government has vast power to crush industries. And the statists, the socialists, want even more power. And we know how that experiment's worked out throughout history and in modern times. The exception to the rule so far, and history will eventually judge this, is China, where there's a lot of power, but they've gotten to where they are by creating pockets of, as you know, of entrepreneurial free markets and rewarding people and they're doing a very delicate kabuki dance, trying to unleash innovators and then rein them back in when they get too wealthy or powerful. So far, it's working out for them. Well, I think if I were I certainly don't how I'd bet how history this will play out over the next half century, and there's already signs that their model's cracking. But, you know, we'll see. But for the United States, the Bernie model of we know better, we're smarter, bureaucrats and politicians know exactly how public, private sector money should be used is classic socialism. A lot of people are seduced by it. I get that, but it's not a slippery slope. It's a cliff. Right? You fall off that cliff and you're in statism and government control, and then you kill growth, you kill freedoms.
Well, let's talk about one of the reasons the opposition to AI centers is driving up utility costs. It's blamed for the rise in electricity rates. In fact, there were several elections last November that were won on this very issue.
Yeah,
But, Mark, nothing is ever said about these politicians that my own state is a good example. We shut down a nuclear plant.
yeah,
We've closed all our coal-fired plants, and California has the highest electricity costs in
yeah,
the country.
yeah.
So what role is, moving from dependable energy and economic energy to things like wind and solar, which are intermittent?
Yeah.
What is that doing to drive the cost of electricity? My own state being an example.
Well, your state is a perfect example of and this is true everywhere in the United States, and in fact in Europe too. The rise in electric rates was already underway before anybody heard the word AI in data centers. So how do you and most of the data centers are still under construction and not yet using any electricity. So how do you blame I mean, it's like the causality is reversed here. The the existence of the words data centers and the announcement of a plan is being blamed for high electric rates that were already high, and they increased to your point, and our think tank published a study on this, end of last year, and you could we the your listeners and viewers can find it at our website, the National Center for Energy Analytics website. Just Google it up and look for what caused high electric rates. So one of our economists just did the obvious survey and looked at what's happened, and you won't be surprised. The primary driver of higher electric rates are in states and places where mandates and subsidies have been imposed to tinker with the electric grid to add lots of intermittent power, solar and wind. Now, it sounds counterintuitive. Solar and wind are free. You're harvesting, there's no fuel costs. Why should that increase electric rates? Well, the answer is nothing's free. The machines cost money. Okay. They're subsidized. But to operate an electric grid, so it provides power anytime you need it, you have to spend money to do something when the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining, obviously. That something else costs money. And that something else costs enough money, all the features of it, more transmission lines, more keeping, backup capacity, running it inefficiently. But all those things together in combination cause electric rates to go up far more than what you save when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. That's what's been happening. That's what happened in California. That's what's happening in New Jersey. So the policies of the green states directly created high-cost electric rates. They now have a very convenient cudgel to beat the oligarchs, to use Bernie's word again, for causing their electric rates to go up. And it's a very effective political tool. You saw what's happened is just last month, the 7 of the big tech companies joined the president at the White House in a signing of a pledge to make sure that building data centers would not cause consumer electric rates to go up. I'm glad they did that. That's an important pledge to make. But again, the rates have gone up thus far, not because of data centers, but because of policies that have been implemented by the states where they have control, and it's almost all state control. So these states are doing it to themselves and to their citizens.
I want to talk about AI and the replacement of jobs. This is another one, a kind of a trope that they throw out there. Oh, if we do this, you've seen companies reduce some payroll because of AI. But you wrote an article that really hit me. I never thought about it. When ATMs first came out, they thought, "Oh my goodness, this is gonna do away with bank tellers." There's more bank tellers today, than before they came out with
Right.
the ATMs.
Yeah, exactly. Well, ATM is the most common example to use. The automated teller machine was going to replace tellers. It did replace the growth rate of tellers, right? That's true. But it didn't eliminate tellers. And as you say, the data show that there are more tellers now than and there are more ATMs. There's more of both. But which is incidentally, as you imagine, the typical story of most automation. But there is a truth to the claim in this sense. Uh, First, technology not only changes jobs, the intention of productivity, which is always technology driven. Some of it's organizational driven, organizing people to be more productive. But most of productivity comes from technology, automating things, new kinds of machinery. The purpose of that is to achieve productivity. And the definition of productivity, as you know, is to reduce inputs to get the same output. There are only three inputs: energy, materials, and labor. So you want to improve efficiency of inputs, which by definition means your goal is to reduce labor hours. And when you reduce labor hours and inputs, you improve profits, you can pay higher wages. But it is true that some jobs growth rates slow, like tellers. We slowed the growth rate down, which was important for bank profitability and efficacy, but we didn't eliminate them. It is true the Luddites were right. The automated loom eliminated manual weaving. They were right. It didn't eliminate all jobs. It didn't eliminate their ability to find another job, but it is disruptive. This is where there's a distinction with a difference that it gets papered over. I'm in the camp. It's net good. It's a spectacular thing, but I'm a realist. I'm not. It's not Pollyanna here. The transitions when you disrupt the workforce are politically incendiary. They're not well managed. They're not thoughtful about it. It's why we have safety nets and training and unemployment insurance. But it doesn't mean the end of work. Here's a statistic that's interesting. This came from David O'Toole, the great economist at MIT, and he's done magnificent work on this for people who are interested in looking at labor force dislocation by technology trends. He documents that roughly 60% of the jobs, the job titles, the nature of jobs, 60% of all the class of jobs that existed in 1960 don't exist as jobs today. Technology changed enough since 1960s, no surprise, that think about that, 60% of the specific job categories. A good example would be the draftsman that worked in the fabs that I worked in as a young man. There are no draftsmen drawing stuff on big lithographs and cutting up, sheets to make masks for semiconductors. They're gone. It's all on a computer. So 60% of the jobs evaporated. So if you were being simplistic back then, you would say, gee, that means 60% of the work is going to be gone in a half century and the unemployment will soar to 60%. That's what you'd sort of say. It didn't. We have essentially full employment. Well, obviously, different jobs emerged to do different things and more jobs for other things, and which he documents. So the question you would ask yourself is, is it going to be different this time? Well, everyone says, yeah, it's going to be different this time. Well, no, the architecture is going to be exactly the same. What will be different is the specific jobs that will be modified, lost, or changed, or amplified. Those will be different, of course, right? I mean, if you automate welding, it doesn't affect the typist in the back office. If you automate typing with a word processor, that affects the typist. Well, okay, we're going to have the same phenomena had again and again.
Mark, as we conclude here, where do you see this playing out? I think, like in California, we're used to brownouts.
Yeah.
People get upset when you can't turn on the air conditioner or the lights go out. I think I just imagine people if you couldn't operate your smartphone or you couldn't shop online.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the principal authority for grid reliability, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, has issued a sequential warnings over the last couple of years that many regions, including California, the Mid-Atlantic, and others, are facing severe threats to grid reliability. And that means higher probability of outages, brownouts, and blackouts. They should be taken seriously. And the reason they're issuing those warnings has nothing to do with data centers, although they will point out data centers are if they're connected to the grid at the scales we're imagining, they will make this problem worse, not better. But the problem is, again, too much intermittent power being added to the grids that you can't call on and operate the grids reliably with. People will be very, very unhappy when the first blackouts happen again. You could take to the bank, one will happen, or a couple or more. And you could take to the bank, they'll blame the utilities. They're not going to blame the green policies. The politicians will blame the utilities. The politicians will blame other people. But these are bad political decisions that are being made in those states, and they will reap a consequence. I don't want to see that happen. We'll be able to fix it. It'll cost money. It'll take a little time, but it's fixable. The problem is, again, when you create these disruptions, as you well know, it has spillover into the political realm, and sometimes the fixes are worse than the than the problems because you know people pass laws that are just misguided based on an overreaction or an agenda of the whatever the green lobby or whoever's pushing something. So I'm very bullish we're going to solve the problem. By the way, I can tell you very briefly how we solve the data center power problem. I wrote about this in a piece in the Washington Post yesterday. I made a prediction, and as you know, my book, I made this statement. I stole Peter Drucker's line about forecasting. You only predict what's already happened. What's his line? It's a great line.
Yeah.
So
So,
what's already happened is that a third of all data centers are going to use off-grid power, private power. Another third haven't announced their plans. I'll bet there'll be private off-grid power. So about a third will be on grids where the grids can handle them, and half to two-thirds will build essentially their own grid, not connect to the public grid. So they won't stress the public grid. They won't impose costs on the public grid. They won't cause blackouts to the public grid. They won't give any benefits to the public grid either, but that the benefits are complicated. So that's what's going to happen. We'll fuel them, and they'll get built in those states. So don't ban them. They'll go where they're welcome. Remember the Walter Wriston line? Money, capital goes to where it's welcome. Well, these
oh yeah.
people, they have a lot of capital. They want to deploy it, and not to become powerful, but to power powerful economic engine, which is this next revolution in the cloud and AI.
Well, Mark, listen, as we close, tell our listeners about your Center for Energy Analytics. And also, I want to mention your book about the cloud revolution. Very prescient, in my opinion.
Well, thank you. I think the book still has forecasts which have been realized, and the ones that I made a few years ago are being realized now. So I feel like I can almost take a victory lap soon. But still, my opinion, it's still worth reading. It's at Amazon, of course, The Cloud Revolution. I co-found with some colleagues a new energy think tank, the National Center for Energy Analytics. We started this just under 2 years ago, and we think we're the only unaligned nonprofit energy think tank that's not focused on environment per se or focused on politics or law. We're focused on energy and energy analytics to try to get the facts out with studies and scholars and articles. And we have a conference coming up on May 1st in Washington called the Energy Future Forum, which your audience can live cast if they go to the magic Dr. Google machine and just put Energy Future Forum 2026. They can sign up to live cast it. If they want to try to come in person, that'd be great. It's in DC. We have a great lineup of speakers. We have the president of energy from Meta. We've got the president of Digital Realty, CEO of Digital Realty coming, the CEO of EQT, Toby Rice, the CEO of EOG, which is the biggest independent oil producer in the shale fields. We've got the chief marketing officer for Hitachi Vernova Nuclear Power. It's a terrific lineup that, I'll do one last pitch for our conference. Because I'm the co-chair, I get to dictate certain things, and one of them is there are no PowerPoints of any kind in the conference. There are no canned speeches. There are no panels of an array of people who don't get a chance to talk. It's all one-on-one fireside chats with leaders in the industry, which is sort of, I think, a refreshing difference for a conference. It's not rare, but it's unusual to have a whole conference structured that way, which is what we've done.
All right. Well, listen, Mark, as always, I want to thank you for coming on the program. All the best and hope to talk to you again.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Jim.